Namaste to all of you. A very warm welcome to this evening's Zoom call. As we do on a daily basis, today also we have a very distinguished speaker for us. Though you all are pretty familiar with the protocols, let me again repeat it for the people who have come for the first time. We will mute all the mics except mine and the speaker Abhinav Prakash ji. And we'll also block the chat. Only you can send it to the host and the co-host. Otherwise, you will not be able to send chat to everyone. It kind of jars, it kind of disturbs the whole process. So once his talk is over, when we open for Q&A, then even the chat will be opened up. So Dheeraj, you can go ahead and block the chat as well. And he would do the initial talk, and after that the Q&A. You know the protocols of Q&A. Please raise a hand. There's a button there. You raise a hand button, and then sequentially we will call you, and we'll unmute you and mute you back. The protocol which you're all pretty familiar with. Friends, I'm honored to invite Abhinav Prakash ji. He is an assistant professor of economics at Delhi University, and he actually writes bilingual in Dainik Jagran, Hindustan Times, and other newspapers and publishings. Then he is today going to focus on what he calls as Twilight of the First Republic and the way forward. So the idea is when India as a republic was formed, whatever were the concepts then, the Nehruvian concepts, are slowly changing as the time changes. So he's going to walk us through this entire process in terms of how the initial, concepts of the republic are undergoing transformation, and how does he see this changing from going forward from here. So let's hear him. Abhinav Prakash ji, floor is yours.
Thank you and welcome to all. Really honored to be here, and thanks for giving me this opportunity. What I'm going to focus on is not as much on the descriptive part of the process. It's more of a, let's say, idea in motion. It's more of a working idea which I'm going to present here, and really focus on, let's say, the broad contours of what has been happening in India. So recently you see, everyone is writing both in the national newspapers and in the international newspapers that how India is no longer a democracy, how India is going the way of fascism and authoritarianism, and how the secularism is collapsing, and all those things. Especially in the international media, if you read it, you find that everything which is going on in India is all bad and all chaotic. And when we look across the country, we also find the same process, a similar kind of a process. We see that there's lots of unrest all around. There's lots of chaos which is happening, including the Delhi riot and so many other things. And there's really no certainty in the Indian political and economic process as of today. And this, what I call, is that what we're living through, our generation, we are literally seeing the fall of the first republic in India. The first republic was when India became independent, and the system and the kind of state formation we adopted and accompanied myths and the intellectual and academic propaganda by the state, that really constituted the first republic. In simple terms, we can say it's a Nehruvian republic. And what we see today, that entire edifice of the Nehruvian republic or the first republic in India is now collapsing. And in my opinion, this process will continue in the years to come. And there literally is not going to be any calm or peace in India. It's going to be far more chaotic than it is today, because as the old order collapses and the new order rises, you always have chaos in between. What I propose to do is to kind of relook at certain things. Number one is the entire myth of India being a secular state, and entire myth of India being, let's say, a Nehruvian kind of mythology that India is a secular state where Hindus and Muslims have lived together forever, happily together, and all those things. Second thing is I'm going to look at the Hindu right itself in a broader sense, because the alternative which is there to the First Republic is basically Hindutva. So I'm just going to throw some ideas to you. Let's see where it goes. I'll more than welcome the feedback on what I think about what is happening. See, when we look at the discourse today, we are told that India was founded on the basis of India's freedom struggle, that India's freedom struggle led to the foundation of this modern Indian state, which was a secular democratic republic. And the assertion by the Hindu right in the pre-independence era, let's say by the Savarkar or by the other people like Madan Mohan Malviya, or going back to the history, the Bengal movement, the entire nationalist movement in Bengal, was kind of a fringe thing, because India was always this society where people believed in communal harmony, people believed in secularism, and you have these fringe elements of Hindu right and the Pakistan movement, which basically destroyed everything. But nonetheless, we were brave enough to create a secular India. Well, I reject this view, because I think that India's national movement, the entire India's freedom struggle movement, was a completely Hindu movement. From its origin in the 19th century, you go back to the Bengal, you go back to Sannyasi movement, you go back to the Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, you go back to Maharashtra, all these social reform movements and the religious reform movements were basically Hindu movements. And all this, what you call the rediscovery of India, because when the Britishers came, they started writing the history of India in a systematic manner. So lots of history which we ourselves had forgotten, right? Like the history of the, let's say, the Mauryan period, the Gupta period, lots of them were systemized by these Europeans. They might have their own biases, the colonial prejudice, but they nonetheless started the modern systematic study of India. So this rediscovery of India's ancient past actually led to this rise of this nationalist feeling. It contributed to the rise of this confidence of India that, well, we are the ancient country, we are the ancient civilization, and we must have our own self-rule. But all those discoveries which led to this fervor of nationalism in India, they were all Hindu based. I mean, I don't see in the entire reading of the India's freedom struggle that people were going, let's say, very euphoric over the Mughal period or the Turkish period. All the elements which we were presenting as the India's essence came from the India's Hindu past. So whether it was the Congress party, whether it was even the Communist party, the Bhagat Singh and all their symbolism, their language, their cultural manifestation was the Hindu manifestation. I mean, Bhagat Singh was part of this socialist network, the underground revolutionaries. They started the initiation in the front of goddess Kali, right? They took oath in the name of Hanuman. Their entire thought process was the Hindu thought process up until at least the mid-20s up till the mid-20s. So India's freedom struggle in my movement was a completely Hindu movement. And it was not just the Hindu movement, it was the continuation of the resurgence of the Hindus, which was already underway before the Britishers came to India. So I see the arrival of the Britishers as a disruption in the process of Hindu resurgence, which was anyways going on in India from the 18th century onwards, right? From the 1700s, the Islamic imperial power was on retreat. It was on decline everywhere. Of course, there were certain strongholds like, let's say, Bengal was there, Mysore was there, Hyderabad was there. But the Islamic imperial power was on decline. There was a massive Hindu resurgence which was going on. The arrival of the Britishers actually disrupted it. And we often forget that the British conquest of India was an extremely brutal process. Somehow we remember the brutality of the Turks and the Mughals, but we somehow give a free pass to the British. But if you look at the conquest of India by the Britishers, it was done in an extremely brutal process, genocides after genocides, destruction of the large swaths of the country. So it disrupted the Hindu resurgence, but nonetheless, the Hindu resurgence remanifested itself in the form of India's modern national freedom struggle. Now, what we were basically trying to do, I mean, as a civilization, what we were basically arguing when the Britishers arrived. Now, Indians always have this sense of say belonging to a culture, right? This whole idea of Bharatvarsha was always there. And Hindus specifically always had a clear sense of what you say, who we are. But what Hindus always lacked was the sense of who we are not. So in the classical Samuel Huntington framework, Hindus had substance, but Hindus did not have salience. Our sense of identity was strong, that we are this, we believe in this, we follow this culture. But our sense of identity of who we are not was very weak. As if you look at the Islamic word or the Christian word, they have a very clear sense of idea who they are not. So when the Britishers arrived in India, and Britishers arrived in the backdrop where lots of transformations were happening across the world. There was rise of modern capitalism, modern industry. The British power was backed by immense industry power and immense, let's say, intellectual movement in the European countries. And we often fail to realize today that it was quite intimidating to the people. Today we see and say, well, West to SI and India is superior. And we criticize the West. But go back to the 19th century or in the 18th century, the rise of the West was an extremely terrifying experience for the non-Western societies. Whether it's China, whether it's India, they were all put on defense. Because Britishers were coming not just on a horseback, right? Unlike the Turks, they were not coming like a horde of the people conquering your country. They were backed by modern technology and modern worldview. And we were put on a complete defensive. We did not know how to deal with that. There were attempts by various people, but we failed to a large extent in the initial years how to respond to the British. One of the greatest intellectual challenge with the British threw at the Indians is that by asking us a simple question, by the way, who you people are, right? So when people started asking that India is a country and we need our self-rule, we need self-independence, the British response was that, well, who are you people? I mean, gentlemen, who you are? Are you a Telugu? Are you a Maratha? Are you a Jat? Are you a Gujar? Or you are a Brahmin? I mean, what is your identity? Who you bunch of people are that you are asking for your self-rule and you are saying that we also deserve equality in the community of the nation? And that was a very formidable challenge thrown at the Indians. And there were several responses to it. And the most prominent response to it, in my opinion, most powerful, was the concept of Hindutva. Because Hindutva basically, for the first time, defined in a more coherent and a proper term that Hindus are a nation. Before that, yes, there have been contestation with the imperial powers. Hindus have always fought with the Islamic imperial power. They have fought with the Europeans, but they have never ever articulated a coherent anti-imperialist ideology, which was Hindutva, which came in the 19th century, which came in the 20th century. Now, Hindutva is what? What is this process which we look at? Now, Hindutva is simply the political response of the Hindu society to Western imperialism and political Islam. Hindutva is not Hinduism, it's a political manifestation of the Hinduism, which is basically different people of different tradition under the dharmic framework coming together under a common identity to resist imperialism. Now, this entire national movement which started, look at its language, its contours, its demands, they were all essentially Hindu demands. I do not see up until, let's say, 1930s or mid-1920s at least, that there was this denial of the Hindu character of the national movement. But the problem is that India also had another problem at that time. That was the Hindus were undergoing a revival movement, but the Muslims, who were the second largest majority in the subcontinent, they were also seeing a revival of the sort. We often do not study the intellectual traditions of the Muslim society. And I'll say that the Hindus are most uninformed people when it comes to the Islamic history and the Islamic intellectual traditions. Now, there was revival of Islamic imperialism as well, and that posed the this rise of pan-Islamism. Basically, we don't realize that Abdul Wahab, which is the Wahhabi stream, founder of the Wahhabism, his student Shah Waliullah was already present in India, and preaching from the preaching from the Akbarabadi mosque in Delhi, jihad against Marathas. He was the one who was writing letters to Abdali to invade India to destroy the Hindu resurgence. So this tradition of Islamic pan-Islamism is also very old in India. Somehow we don't talk about it. So there was revival of the pan-Islamism in India as well, and the Muslims were asserting themselves that they do not want to share power with the Hindus, and we want to maintain our feudal privileges, because remember, at least in the North India, the Muslims were disproportionately part of the feudal elites. So that posed a challenge to India's freedom struggle. And the response of the Congress party, which was by that time the most preeminent Hindu party. The Congress itself was the Hindu party. We often don't realize it now. Was to weave this myth and rhetoric of Hindu-Muslim unity and Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb. So Congress thought that we can handle the Muslim question in the subcontinent by indulging in myth making, that Hindus and Muslims have always lived together peacefully. There's a composite culture, there's a Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb. And after India became independent, you see this myth was continued to be propagated by the state propaganda and by the academia. But the point is that Congress failed, partition of India did happen, and this entire myth was proven to be wrong, but it continued to be in existence for decades after independence. See, the Hindus and Muslims in India have lived together, that's true. But Hindus and Muslims in India have always lived together separately. They have never lived together in the same colonies. They have never lived together as in the same village often. It was more of a forceful coexistence that they lived together, which gave rise to certain common cultural traits, which is natural. I mean, there's nothing unnatural about two communities living together and intermingling and giving rise to certain kind of a shared culture. But the problem is that the Muslims and the Hindus in Indian subcontinent historically have never ever lived together. Whatever commonalities you see in the medieval history was of two types. One was the Hindus who converted to Islam, and remember, lots of upper caste converted to Islam. You go to the UP belt and Rajasthan belt, you find villages after villages of the Rajputs. You go to Kashmir, all the Brahmins, there are lots of conversion which happens to Islam. It's not just that the Dalits and the Shudras were converted. So if you see in the Western UP as well, I mean, the Jats were pretty much united because a Hindu Jat and a Muslim Jat, we share the same Gotra. So they will not marry with each other, but apart from that, they were all united as a social unit. That was because that the Muslims had carried, even after conversion, their pre-Islamic identities and connections and traditions and cultures, which what we today celebrate as, there was lots of commonalities within the Hindus and the Muslims. But in the last 100 years, with the rise of Tablighi Jamaat and Wahhabi school of thought and Deobandi school of thought, those traditions and those cultures from the Muslim community has been slowly removed. So you don't find those identities now survive among the Muslim communities. Second part is Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb was simply the urban feudal culture. I mean, the feudal elites of Hindus and Muslims, the Jamindars and all sitting together, enjoying some Muzra and song, does not create a unified culture. It's simply an urban elite culture. I mean, in every society, in every time you have an elite culture, you have a mass culture. In the mass culture, there was no composite culture because the mass culture was entirely Hindu culture. If you go to Delhi and Lucknow in the 18th century, 19th century, you will find this composite culture which we celebrate today, but it was very flimsy. It was only at the surface. And it didn't took very much for it to completely unravel, which we see in the form of the partition. Now, what happens is that after the partition happened and India becomes independence, somehow I will say it's a tragedy of the history that the Nehruvian elites continued to, or they were able to capture power and let's say, shape the policy and the India's trajectory for the decades to come. But it was a setback to the Hindu nationalism, but I'll say all was not lost. Because Indian state, which was created in 1947, in my opinion, was never the secular state. India has never been a secular state. The Indian state, which came into existence in 1947, which I will say was essentially a Hindu reformist state. Even though it imagined itself as a secular state, even though our rulers and ruling class denied that it's a Hindu state, that it's a secular state, the character of the Indian state which came into existence, I'm repeating it again, it was a Hindu reformist state. See, what did it do? I mean, this is the first state in the India's history which abolished caste system. There is no state in India's history which took a stand against the untouchability. I don't find any state. There's no state in the Indian history which did as much of social reforms in the Hindus as the Indian state did. So what it did, it abolished the caste system, it integrated the society to a large extent, it Sanskritized the Dalits and the tribals to the large extent, it systemized the social laws, it revived the classical Hindu art form and the folk culture, the patronage which was completely withdrawn from the Indian languages because Farsi was the language of the large parts of the country, even in the south, under Hyderabad and Tipu Sultan and all those people. They actually sought to replace the Telugu and the Kannada with the Farsi language. Now the revival, the coming of the Indian state, the modern Indian state. Now we talked about secularism, we say Urdu, Farsi bhi bhasha hai. But what has actually happened in the last 70 years that Urdu, Farsi have been completely replaced from the mainstream and been replaced by the Hindi and the other languages like Kannada, Tamil, and the Telugu, which got the state patronage. The Hindu state, this state controls the Hindu temples. It has also introduced an element of uniformity as well. Now, lots of people disagree with that, but as I said, it's a Hindu state, it's a Hindu reformist state. It has its own vision. And this is the state which continues to intervene in the Hindu society in the last 70 years with the popular legitimacy. Now, nowadays, when there's a lots of clamor in the Hindu right, when they say state should not intervene into the Hindu social laws or the religious institutions, but that's, in my opinion, is not the majority view. When Indian state decides to take over temples, the majority of the Hindus welcome it. That's also the reality. I mean, when Samajwadi Party was in power in UP, they decided to overtake 2 temples in Mathura, and everyone supported it because the temples were so badly run before the takeover of the government. So even though there are difference of opinion among a section of Hindu right, but the point is that the Indian state enjoys popular legitimacy to intervene into the Hindu social and religious laws alone. It cannot intervene into the Muslim laws. It cannot intervene into the Christian laws because this is not a secular state, because it has always been a Hindu state in denial. So what I'm saying is that the Hindu nationalism and the Hindu character of the Indian state was always clear. It was never the fringe element. It was the Nehruvian secularism which was the fringe in India, but unfortunately a fringe which controlled the state power. And now what you're seeing today is simply the breakdown of that order, and that has been led by, I say, lots of factors. One of the major factors has been the economic reforms and the urbanization of India. So the moment you have the industrial growth in the country, the moment you have the urban growth in the country, what you see is that the social identities, the parochial social identities of reason, of caste, this starts breaking down. Because once you have urbanization and industrialization, you see the people are uprooted from their villages. They are forced into a major city, mega city. The people of different caste who were living separately in their villages, now they have to live together in the working area, in the same apartment, in the same working class colonies, and the work in the same factory. That leads to what I say, a breakdown of the older identities and the rise of a common identity. And what is the common identity of the majority of the people? That is Hinduism. So while the people in the villages have very strong identity that I belong to this caste, that I am a Yadav, or I am a Thakur, I am a Rajput. You see in the urban centers, the Hindu identity starts to dominate. And this is a long process, we don't have time to discuss that much. But what is happening is that the rise of the middle class in India and the rise of the urban centers in India has actually led the process of the collapse of the Nehruvian elite and the assertion of the Hindu character of India, which I think it was always there. And now what we're seeing today is that the elites who are ruling in India, the Nehruvian elites, they are slowly losing the debate and slowly losing the power. What is BJP? I mean, the BJP and RSS, I would say in the historical view, they are simply the modern vehicle of the historical process of the rise of the Hindu Rashtra in India. The process was underway even in the 18th century. RSS was formed in 1925. BJP was formed in the 1980s. They are the modern political vehicles, cultural vehicles of the historical process, which is the rise of Hindu India. And what we're seeing today, India is becoming what it was always supposed to become, right? To become a Hindu state, in my opinion, was always the destiny of India. The destiny was denied in 1947, but denial of the destiny does not mean that the destiny has been buried. So what you see today, what is BJP doing in power? The rise of BJP is simply reorienting the Indian polity towards its more natural trajectory of being a Hindu country. So in the north, what you see that the Kashmir is fully integrated now. In the south, the Dravidian movement is melting away. I mean, you can see the change even in Tamil Nadu. In the east, even Bengal is now turning saffron. In the Western India, the secular parties are now forced to ally with the Hindutva parties to survive. The political debate has completely shifted away from the secular and pseudo-secular paradigm to Hindu and pseudo-Hindu paradigm. The Ram Mandir is done. The CA is the law. NPR will happen and NRC will come sooner or later. So this is the process which we are seeing today. And that is obviously leading to severe backlash from the old order. And this, the struggle which came in open over the CA and the NRC, simply shows that the churning which is going on in India is very, very deep. And this process in the future is going to continue. And we have to wait and see what is going to happen. And this is what I think is happening in India. A kind of a very broad overview, not going into much of the detail because we have limited time, but I will be more than happy to listen to your views and your ideas. Thank you.
Abhinavji, thanks a lot for your talk. And I had explicitly said time is not a constraint. So that's okay. Anyway, I think it was a very good thought-provoking talk that you gave. Different perspective, that it is a reformist Hindu movement, a different perspective.
Reformist Hindu state.
Hindu state, right. So now the problem is, how do we, how do you see this backlash happening from especially Islamic, section, it started much before Delhi. For sure, CA was just a symptom. Because CA, they don't have any logic why they are agitating. But then it was just, I suppose, the last straw or the spark which ignited the whole thing. Ram Janmabhoomi and so many things, Triple Talaq, it was building up. And then now you see all the forces coming together in terms of, somebody from UAE tweets, Arundhati Roy tweets, and Imran Khan says something. Whole Islamophobia thing is going to be thrown at. And nowhere in this paradigm you see the old order, be it Congress, all these guys, Samajwadi Party, Dalit parties. They are not the players, at least in the front. There are newer guys who have taken over. So how do you see this panning out, and how long do you think this kind of thing is going to happen? And where do you see this ending up at? Ideally, what they are looking at is the people who are unleashing this, they want another partition of India. In fact, in Tamil Nadu, they have started, you have given one country to Muslims and one for Hindus. we need for Christians. So there's a Christian movement which is happening. And of course, we already know Nagaland for Christ movement is anyway there.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see these things happening where the old political order is losing its relevance, but newer players, faceless at least, and leaderless, but then emerging into a very strong forces attacking the core of Hindutva or Hindu forces? How do you look at it?
See, that is bound to happen. I mean, remember the character of the Islamic power in India is that it has always relied on outside support to rule India. So look at the history of the last 6-7 centuries. Whenever the ruling dynasties of power, Islamic dynasties and powers of India weakened, there was a fresh invasion of India and it was restored, right? So there's nothing new in that they're asking, tweeting to these Arab sheikhs and all those people that save us, we are under stress. On the ground, nothing is happening against the Muslims. I don't see anything happening against the Muslims, apart from what you said, the normal communal problem, which always existed in the country. But the problem is that they have realized that they have lost the hope of regaining political power in the near future. See, what I wrote in one of the articles, that the situation today is just like the redux of the Marathas in Delhi, right? So the Marathas, after centuries, you have a Hindu power ruling from Delhi. And I have no hesitation in saying that this is a Hindu government, after all. Its character is, at least, is not an anti-Hindu government. So now you have a Hindu power in Delhi after centuries, basically. And then you have all the enemies mobilizing, both within and outside India. And nothing else explains, in my opinion, this extreme hostility, even from the West. Because remember, the Hindus are the one who are delusional. They are in denial. But the other side is not in denial. They see what is happening. The Muslims are very clear as to what is happening. The Western world sees the rise of Hindu nationalism as a threat in the future. But we who have to become more serious about playing the big power game. Unfortunately, Hindus remain one of the most uninformed people in the world. They have no interest in learning what is happening outside their border. I mean, what explains the complete absence of Hindu records or Hindu observation of the foreign countries in the history? The Hindu traders were going to China, they were going to Rome, they were going to Greece, they were going to Arabia, they were going all over the world. But you do not see any systematic records, any historical document of what they saw in those countries in medieval time or in the ancient time. Whereas when it comes to India, you follow all the Muslim records of India. The Westerners coming to India have left a very rich records. So that is a Hindu problem. I mean, we are blind in a sense that we refuse to see beyond our, beyond our nose. And it's a frog in the well mentality, which I think has been cultivated over millennia by the caste system. So because Hindu worldview rarely extends beyond the interest of their caste, and it is applicable to every caste, right? So because your social structure is such that you are always self-obsessed and obsessed with your own community, that you fail to see what is happening beyond the borders. When it comes to, I'm not very familiar with what is happening with the Christians in the South, but I will not be surprised as to what their missionaries are doing. But I do not see that the Islamic power in India is going to revive. They are going to remain a powerful force because remember, we have Pakistan and Bangladesh as well. So demographically, the Muslims are going to remain the powerful force. They cannot uproot the Hindu power, at least in the coming centuries, but they have and they can impose the civil war on India, right? It is a possibility. It's up to the Indian state and the Hindu community to deal with it. And certainly it cannot be dealt in the crass manner in which we are seeing nowadays. All these media coverage of Corona jihad and all is too third class and too childish. This is not how you deal with serious problems. Not by provoking your opponents even more and making fun of yourself in the entire international community. Coming to other kind of a thing, see, India even today is a Hindu polity, whether it's the Dalit politics, whether it's the communist politics in India, whether it's the Samajwadi politics, whether even it's the Dravidian politics. They are part of the Hindu polity. Even if they are opposing the Hindu and Hinduism, they are part of this Hindu polity because they have no existence out of it. there is no left-wing communist party in the Pakistan. There is no Dalit politics in the Pakistan. There is no social justice politics in the Pakistan. These are the characteristics of the Hindu polity. And I don't think that we need to be too much afraid of these polity. I mean, the point is that we have to take it for granted that a big country like India will have different political expressions. So if we are too, let's say, obsessed or too fearful of these kind of assertions, we are literally fighting the battles which are not really very important. Second part is that, yes, the partition of India in the coming centuries, if not in the coming decades, is a possibility. Because remember, India is a Hindu reformist state, but India is not a nation state, in my opinion. India is a civilizational state. The boundaries of India are coterminous with the extent of the Indian civilization. So historically, as the Indian civilization has shrunk, the boundaries of India have always shrunk. The partition of India in 1947 was not simply the process of nationhood and nation state, all those modern processes. It is simply that a large number of the population of the Indian subcontinent shifted its allegiance to a different civilization narrative. So they no longer saw themselves as the part of the Indian story, right? So the Pakistanis are very clear about this thing, that they do not see the Islam and Muslims as the part of the Indian civilization. So it was a civilizational rupture that we see happened in 1947. And as if the demographic change continues and the civilizational boundaries of India continue to shrink, the partition of India is certainly a reality in the next 100, 200 years.
Yeah, I mean, while you said that, be it the Dravidian parties or any of these are part of the Hindu polity, the problem is they are the ones who are actually nurturing these anti-Hindu forces. You know, right from Kanyakumari, you know what happened in Kodankulam, Kanyakumari, Tuticorin, the 40% of Indian copper production got stopped because church decided it so. It is completely a Christian movement. It was a violence unleashed by the church. So right from Kanyakumari, in fact, if you go to Kanyakumari, save the Kanyakumari temple, entire things around is completely Christian. So in fact, you see a lot of Jesus statues welcoming you to India. You don't find any Hindu deity welcoming anybody to India. So from that point onwards, you go up to Odisha coast or up to Bengal. The entire coast is now heavily Christianized. So much so that they could hoist a very powerful, with a huge mandate, powerful chief minister in Andhra Pradesh. Right? So it is something which is a gift of these parties who, according to you, you're saying the part of the Hindu polity.
Yeah, because they are
no worry.
So I'm not saying that they're Hindu parties. I'm saying they are part of the Hindu polity because India is the Hindu polity. They are the elements who operate within the Hindu polity, right? They cannot operate outside it. That is my point. Just like communism is the part of the Western polity, right? Even though the communists were the one who waged the most systematic cultural war against the West, but they had no existence out of it. Similarly, Dravidian parties are, if you see it as a problem, even then they are the part of the Hindu polity. This is what I'm saying.
Yeah. So anyway, Hindus are problems for Hindus themselves is a issue you all are aware of it. That's where it stands. How do you see this panning out? How long do you think this thing is going to go on, where the old order will take time to die its natural deaths? And then how do you see this emerging? Do you see that it's going to be a rupture between civilizational thoughts and then we're going to have a lot of disturbed lifestyle? Or would you see one of them asserting and then you see some kind of equilibrium happening? How do you see this panning out?
See, there is no certainty as to what will happen, right? Because when the changes happen, history is not linear. So India was supposed to become a Hindu country in 1947, it didn't become. But there's no guarantee that we will move toward that direction inevitably, right? So problem is that the other side, which wants to replace the old order, itself is very confused, which is Hindutva. So, I mean, the problem on Hindutva side, or let's say the Hindu side, not just Hindutva, but the Hindu side as well, that we have not even begun to engage with the modernity. So I don't find any literature, any serious thinking. Let's look at the Islamic world, right? The Islamic world from the 70s onwards contested modernity. They rejected it, and they said, we are going to turn our back against the modernity. And we will create our own, version of the modern Islamic identity. And they succeeded. The Chinese have done that to a great extent. They say no Western modernity, Han modernity. The Hindus have not even, begun to engage with this idea. So all discussion you see in Hindu side is basically, this is our Indic thought, this is our Indic culture, this is our Indic education system. No blue draft. There's no blueprint, no draft as to what they want to do. We're not engaging with the frontier areas of the knowledge production in the social sciences. Only what we end up doing is harping about some 19th and 20th century debates, the Gandhi ka Gram Swaraj and all those things, or all those things we are talking about. So we are not being able to put a proper intellectual framework for the future. So the future in that sense is uncertain. We have the collapsing order, but the most powerful force which can replace it, Hindutva itself, is not prepared, in my opinion. This is again just like the Marathas in Delhi. The history was moving towards a particular direction. Marathas were the most powerful people, but they could never replace the Mughal Empire, right? This is what is happening. This is I use the word, that's the redux of Marathas in Delhi, very carefully. What we need to do is that we need to understand that India is very rapidly becoming an urban society. India is very rapidly going to become an industrial society. And this old discourse of 20th century is not going to sustain ourselves. Harping about tradition and culture and Sanskriti is not going to sustain you for long. Why? Because when societies change, when they industrialize, when they become urban, lots of the Sanskriti which we talk about, which is basically derived from the agrarian cultural milieu, will disappear. Because industrialization is not simply about having a factory or having new technology. Industrialization is a complete social transformation, right? It has never happened in any part of the world that the societies have become industrialized and they have retained their medieval or the ancient culture and tradition, right? The identity might survive, but that tradition and culture, the Sanskriti, changes itself. So we need to be more serious about playing this game, because I always say that Hindus are the most unserious player in the international stage. What does the future hold? I don't know. This chaos will continue unless until new tradition or new something, the system rise up.
Okay, fair enough. I think we'll now open it up for the Q&A. And Dheeraj, you can open up the chat also. And as people, try and ask the questions, I think we have Venkatramana ji from Karimnagar. Please go ahead, sir.
Namaste ji.
Namaste.
I would like to thank you very much, sir, from the bottom of my heart for precisely reflecting my thoughts on Hinduism, Hindutva and Bharat, because I strongly believe in a casteless Hindu society, and however much you deny that culture is ever changing, what we call modernization is actually not, westernization is not actually westernization, but it is modernization, because even in Western countries, the church is against certain cultures, certain things which the Western society is following. And I would like to ask you one question, sir, about some people saying that because of the British coming into India, we were stopped from becoming a totally Islamic country. How far is it right, and how do you deny this, that Britishers have stopped us from becoming an Islamic country?
Well, it's not entirely true, because if you see the arrival of the British, the harsh fact is that Hindus in lots of places welcomed the British rule. In Bengal, in all those places, the Hindus were really very happy that the Muslim rule has been replaced by the British rule. Because see, the British, when they were coming from a different society. They're not simply coming from a, let's say when the Turks and the Mughals came to India, they came from a same kind of medieval feudal society, right? Britishers were coming from a society which has undergone profound intellectual transformation with the Renaissance and Enlightenment. So they had some different ideas of the societies. One of those ideas was what you call that religious freedom should be given more or less to the people. It was not as consolidated in the 18th century, but by the 19th century, the new intellectual movements in the Europe, which is the rise of humanism and secularism, did change the lots of outlook of the British rulers in India as well. But it's a harsh fact that the Hindus welcomed the British rule in the places where they were earlier under the Muslim rule. But overall, to say that the Britishers somehow saved Hindus from the Muslim rule is completely wrong, because Hindus were already the dominant power in the large parts of the subcontinent, right? It's basically the British rule which systematically cultivated and revived the Muslims, the Muslims in the army in India. So the British army was more than 50% Muslim, if I'm not wrong. I don't know, I have to go to check my facts, but the Britishers after the 1857 rebellion, and 1857 rebellion was basically led by the Bengal army and the what you call the UP, Bihar belt and all those people. After that, they systematically decided not to recruit lots of Hindus from these parts of the country. They shifted their focus to the Muslims from the northwestern frontier provinces, from the Punjab and all those places. So, and remember, the British were the one who patronized the Muslim League and all kind of Islamic politics in India. And had it not been the British ruling India in 1947, I'm pretty sure partition would not happen in the way it happened. It was the British who stopped and prevented Hindus from fighting it over, right? In the absence of the British rule, I don't think such large parts of India would have gone to the Pakistan. So I just completely disagree with this belief that British saved Hindus from the Muslims. No, completely wrong. Yes, in the initial years, some Hindus were very happy in certain parts of the country because British rule was far more, just under quotes than the Islamic rule.
Okay. But then we had this brief interlude of course, Maratha rise was one aspect. We also had the Sikh rise,
Yeah.
Rana Ranjit Singh, or even before that, Banda Bahadur, the Guru Gobind Singh. We had a series of actions that happened from them. But then, today it is kind of, they were supposed to be part of the Hindu pantheon, which was supposed to be a protectors for the Hindus. But today they have drifted apart so much. We had this Khalistan movement, and of course it seems to have ebbed, but then there are some sparks here and there. But largely I figured out wherever I go, the intermingling of Hindu and Sikh communities, which was the norm earlier, you don't see that. Typical what I can see that is in Kashmir, for instance. If you go to Kashmir, every ancient Kashmiri temple has a Gurudwara attached to it. Because these people had gone there to protect the Hindus of Kashmir.
Yeah.
Now the Pandits have all gone away, temples are all abandoned, but the Gurudwaras are there. So somewhere this role of the Sikhs seems to have failed, or they have moved on. They don't, and the government of India also gives them a minority status. Somewhere they also probably feel that they are not part of Hindu structure. There's some issue about it, which could, in times to come, it could diversify into a problem area. How do you see it?
Yes, it's mostly the Sikhism has started becoming more of a monotheistic religion now in the Abrahamic fold, right? So they believed in one God, formless, Nirgur Bhakti basically, but they have, I think it's more of a internal debate of the Sikhs, how they deal with that, because we saying something or doing something about it is only going to backfire. So they have to decide whether they want to remain in the their own original framework of Nirgun Bhakti rather than becoming a copy of the Abrahamic monotheism. And Abrahamic monotheism always leads to this kind of tendencies, the exclusion of the other people, violence, demand of separation. That's a characteristic of Abrahamic monotheism. So, but I don't think that is much of a problem. You see that problem mostly on the internet, on the online. On the ground, I don't think that's very serious problem. It was once upon a time, but it's fading away. There are efforts to revive it, no doubt about it, but I don't think it can revive because demography is also something. Punjab of today is not the Punjab of the 80s.
Yeah, but somewhere I find that somehow there is a certain degree of discomfort globally. I don't see that kind of purpose for which Sikh Panth was created panning out on the ground. That I don't see that.
Yeah, no, that's true because see, the Sikh, the Khalistan movement is not the handiwork of the Pakistan. The Khalistan movement is the handiwork of the Western intelligence agencies. So even at the time of Indira Gandhi, you go to the 70s and the 60s, whenever you have a strong government in Delhi, you will suddenly see Khalistan movement reviving. And whenever there's a weak government in Delhi, it suddenly goes down. It was very clear in the 60s and the 70s. When Indira Gandhi was out of power, no Khalistan movement anywhere. Indira Gandhi comes back to power, Khalistan movements revive across the world. It is documented by intelligence agencies as well that the Western intelligence agencies use the Khalistan movement as the pressurizing tactics against India. So I don't think we can do much about it because they are all located outside India. What we can do is that make sure that we do not overreact. As you see, they're trying to provoke Hindus and Muslims. Let's leave it, in my opinion, right? Let the time will play it out. Yeah. Be vigilant about the what is happening in the background, which is the job of our intelligence agencies, certainly not the job of the social media warriors.
I mean, we see this panning out in Delhi, for instance. The Delhi riots, we saw Gurudwaras supplying food for those Shaheen Bagh fellows. And Sardars coming and sitting there and supporting the CAA.
Most of them were
obnoxious. That was very obnoxious.
Most of them were the workers of the Communist Party. So remember, Punjab has a very long history of communist movement. So these kind of formations remained influential in Punjab. So it's not that the Sikhs are going. Most of them were activists, using their identity that I am Sikh, I am here, not telling that they are part of this organization and that organization.
Okay, sure. Ramon ji, please go ahead. Yeah.
Sir, good evening, sir, everybody.
Yeah.
Sir, the speaker was telling, sir, you were telling that India is not a nation state. Neither India is a, Hindu state. Then what is India? Should we take it as it's a country where certain homogeneous as well as heterogeneous simply live together yet differently?
No, I did not say that India is not a Hindu state. I said India is a Hindu reformist state.
Yes.
And it's less of a nation state because we really do not fit, India does not fit into the framework of the nation state, that a homogeneous entity which has, kind of a same language kind of a thing. India essentially is a civilizational state, right? So what you're seeing, the Republic of India is what? So when there was no Republic of India, then also Bharat existed, right? So Tamil Nadu was a separate kingdom. Northeast was a separate kingdom. Bengal was a separate political entity. Different parts of the Indian subcontinent have for most of the time in India's history have been separate political entities. What you see today as the Indian state, that all these components of the Bharat Varsha are under a single state, a single authority. And that is Indian state, which is not a nation state like France or Germany. It's essentially a European Union, which they want to, which they never became, right? So European Union wants to become what Republic of India is, and they have failed miserably. So we are a civilization state, just like had European Union became a unified political entity, it would have been a civilization state. The character of...
Sir, is there a possibility of ourselves declaring as a Hindu state in the days to come?
See, that is what the trajectory is, in my opinion. So, Hindus remain the only stateless religious group in the world. I mean, the major religious group. So, Muslims have dozens of Islamic states. The Christians have Christian states. Britain is also a Christian state. The head of the government and the head of the state is also the leader of the church, the Queen Elizabeth. Hindus are the only major religious groups which are stateless. There is no explicit Hindu state in the world. And to expect of Hindus that Hindus are going to behave differently from what Muslims behave or what Muslims desire or what Christians desire, I think was always a fool's idea. So Hindus do desire a Hindu state. They have been trying for centuries. Perhaps it is possible in the future. If not explicitly, perhaps we can see with different laws and different changes which we are seeing today, it might become a de facto, if not a de jure Hindu state.
Thank you.
Thank you. But how do you see the Muslim, society transforming from here on? What happened historically, you did mention, but how do you see them going forward? Let's say you said they came up with their own narrative, largely funded by the petrodollars and the Wahhabi propaganda that went, right? Now that the petrodollars are going to go down and the world is going to be a different world, especially after Chinese virus, how do you see their trajectory? If you have to put your bet on, how do you think the Muslim society is going to have a trajectory?
No, I think that fall of petrodollars is not going to have major impact on the Muslim polity because the Arab world was never the determining factor in the Muslim world. Barring the initial 1 or 2 centuries of the rise of Islam, the Arabs have never played a great role in the Islamic history. It was always the Turks, the Iranians who were the dominant power. Arabs became important from the 70s onward, basically. I mean, if you go back to the 60s, you look at the state of Dubai, nothing. So even if the Arab power, Gulf power basically goes down, it's not going to change the nature of the Muslim polity that much. Right? Only that Wahhabism might decline and all those things might happen. But remember, the historical power centers of Islamic world were Iran, Egypt, Turkey, and India. We forget that India was a major center of the Islamic power in the history. Even before the rise of the Arabs in the pre-independence era, it was the Turkey which exercised huge influence on the Indian Muslim polity. I think we will move towards that point again. With the decline of the Gulf countries, the Turkey is the only powerful state in the Muslim world, which is a modern state as well. Pakistan is too medieval in that sense. Even though Pakistan has nuclear bomb, but Pakistan does not have that kind of influence. Egypt, I don't think is going to revive. Iran, we don't know. So I see a reorientation towards this pan-Islamism of Khilafat time, right? So this orthodoxy of Wahhabism is going to decline, but it is going to be replaced by, let's say, Jama Masjid Imam powers will decline, but likes of Sharjil Imam will rise.
Okay. No, but don't you think, Indian Muslims are going to they also have a role to play in terms of setting the evolution of Muslims across the globe? Shouldn't they produce an alternate narrative of more accommodative, democratic or, modern kind of outlook to the rest of the Muslim world? Do you think they will be able to do it, or these people will be part of a worldwide movement and they just get sucked in? How do you view them?
Well, what is Pakistan? Pakistan is India under Islam. If they have not been able to produce the modern democratic state in Pakistan, why do you think that the trajectory will be any different in India? I'm not very hopeful, right? I'm literally not very hopeful because Pakistani Muslims are basically, same as at least the North Indian Muslims. So the same trajectories, religious, social thought process affects both the communities across the border. Kerala is a good example. I mean, the most educated Muslim community, among the most educated Muslim community in the world. But look at the trajectories towards more and more orthodoxy. So I'm not very hopeful, and I'll not rather want to comment because that's not really the topic of the discussion. That might lead to a different trajectory altogether.
Okay.
But not really very hopeful in the near future.
Okay, sure. Chaitanya ji, please go ahead. Chaitanya, please ask the question.
Chaitanya here. Can you hear me?
You
Yes.
can, but you can't see you though. Yeah.
Okay. So, good evening, Abhinavji, Giridharji. See, when you talked about industrialization and the impacts on the culture and the culture weaning away, I understand there are no precedents anywhere else in the world. But considering the kind of background we have, the kind of survival rates we had over different cultures coming and occupying us, will you think we stand a better chance of sort of turning it away from what has already happened in the world? The culture and Sanskriti being there as part of industrialization. I mean, I see a lot of modern Indians right now in fairly high positions. I come from corporate world. I see a lot of guys getting back to their roots more than ever before. It's not the same. So do you think we have a chance of making a difference, or you think we'll follow the industrialized route of every other country in the world, which has lost its Sanskriti and culture when it became industrialized? Thank you.
There are 2 points in what we are saying. You assume that all others have lost their Sanskriti and culture. This is another fallacy of ours. We think that the French and the Germans and the English do not have their culture. They have their culture. Their culture is defined by their history, their medieval history, their ancient history, and they are also very proud of their ancient culture. So first of all, it's a mistake on our part that we think that other countries don't have ancient culture, only we have ancient culture. No, China has it, Japan has it. Japan is the only modern country, only model of the modernity apart from the Western modernity, and Japan retains the civilization identity. So that is the first fallacy there. Second point is that this idea of there is some pristine, timeless, unchanging culture which Hindus have is wrong. The culture has always changed historically. The culture of the 18th century Maharashtra, of the Maratha Empire, was not same as the culture of the 15th century Maharashtra. The Hindu culture of the 12th century was not the same as the culture of the Gupta period. The Hindu culture of the Gupta period was not the same as the culture of the, let's say, the Mauryan period or the pre-Buddha period. So the culture always changed. So this obsession of the Indians into, or let's say, this wrong belief that the culture is timeless, it never changes, and there is some kind of pristine original culture we can go back to is wrong. So culture always changes. So what we're talking about in the corporate world, yes, they are asserting their identity, but they're also improvising. So the way they practice their culture in the corporate world you can see around you is not the same as a Hindu household would celebrate in a village, right? Because that is impossible. That is materially impossible. So the more you become urban, the more you become industrial, the society changes, its social ethos will change, which will be informed by your ancient culture and history. My point is that the Hindu culture itself will change. It's not that Hindu culture is going anywhere. The characteristic will start changing.
When I meant corporate culture, I didn't mean the culture of a corporate. I just meant people in the corporates who are in the modern and ultra modern people. More and more people who didn't talk about Sanskriti or culture are now more getting it. That's what I meant. I didn't mean.
Yes, I got your point. I got your point. I'm saying that
I understand.
That's true. That's a revival, but a revival of the assertion of the identity. But that is not the same culture which their great-great-grandfather would have been following. There is already a change. You can see that.
Okay.
So you're saying no hope that they're bound to change.
Yeah.
Thank you. But then Abhinavji, every time a civilization comes to a certain degree of maturity and some kind of equilibrium or tranquility, there would be some barbarian horde which comes in, knocks it off, creates a lot of disturbance or whatever. This has happened repeatedly. So the moment you are in a matured stage, what happens is you shun violence. You think violence is not great. There are better things, purpose changes. So given that kind of a situation, do you think such a repetition is possible to the Hindu civilization? Do you think there would be some kind of a violent backlash which the Hindu civilization is not prepared for? The modernity, as they keep embracing, somewhere this the thought process that violence is bad and we are not civilized, that is probably going to make them vulnerable. That's what I'm trying to come at.
Yeah, I'm getting a point, but I don't think so, because we are on the ascendancy at the moment. So Hindu civilization is again on the rise. We had a very dark chapter in the past few centuries, but now we are a rising power. I don't think that what you were talking, that we have become too sophisticated and others can defeat us, that is no longer possible. That is a fear with respect to the Western Europe nowadays. That they have completely lost the will to fight. That is not true for India. And remember, this non-violence was never a Hindu idea. I mean,
True.
It's just a Gandhian myth. It's a complete, utter lie. The non-violence is not a Hindu idea. Hindus were never non-violent. Hindus have been extremely, the Hindu polity, if you look at the historical evidence, the Hindu polity has itself been very violent. Yeah. We have our wars, we have our warrior culture, and that is why we survive. We survive not by singing bhajans, but by fighting, right?
Yeah.
It was the Britishers who systematically, for the first time, disarmed us. If you read the records of the Mughals, I mean, in the time of Akbar, now the Mughal capital was Agra, but it was next to impossible, even in the time of the Akbar, for the Mughal tax collectors to go into the Hindu village and collect taxes. There was so much heavy resistance. So the Hindus were always militarized. It were the Britishers who, after 1857, systematically disarmed the Hindus. The result was very disastrous. That it is after 1857, you see, that the Hindus started getting wiped out from the large parts of the subcontinent. This is for the first time in the thousands of years that Hindus do not exist in Afghanistan, that Hindus do not exist in Kashmir and Pakistan, that Hindus do not exist from the last parts of the Bangladesh, that Hindus are getting wiped out even from several pockets of the India. This has never happened before, because Hindus were always regimented and militarized.
Yeah.
The effect of British rule.
So that is precisely what I'm asking. See, the moment you start becoming Gandhians yourself, you are probably losing that Kshatriya in you, the fighting spirit in you, which could be detrimental to you. Somebody could just overrun you. That's what I asked. I somehow feel that's where we are getting at. Hello? I think he's got a connection issue. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
No, I don't think we are that sophisticated, frankly speaking. We retain our barbaric streak even today.
Okay.
So
great.
we will survive.
Fine. I mean, let's be barbarians for some more time at least. CSR Prabhu Garu, please go ahead. CSR Prabhuji. Where is he? Dheeraj, you have to unmute him. I'm not finding him. Yes, sir, Prabhu, I think he seems to have lost his connection. That's okay. Fine. Indira ji, please go ahead, madam.
1 minute. Hello. Hello.
Yeah,
can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Please go ahead, madam.
Sir, earlier I had only one question. Now I have two questions to ask. The thing is, you said about Hindus could be violent at times. My question is, we are living in a constitutional democracy. The rule of law should prevail, and Hindus can show their aggression if they want to by doing strikes, but not militantly, isn't it? The other question is regarding temples. What I mean to say is, temples are taken over by the government. then the temple funds, how they are using, they have an IAS officer, but the thing is how they are using that they don't have any, we don't have any transparency. Can they not put in internet how they are using the funds? Because we are donating it for the temple purpose, for the deity purpose, for all the other amenities purpose, not for secular governments using it. What do you say about it?
Thank you. I mean, I'm not saying that Hindus should go and start fighting and creating violence. I'm simply saying, in response to the question that can Hindus fight, I said they can fight. I mean, the question was that are Hindus too peaceful and non-violent that they cannot fight when it comes to it? I'm saying no, that's not true. That is true nowadays largely for the Western Europe, but not for the Hindus. Second point regarding Hindu temples and all, yeah, I getting a point, but I'm not an expert on those things. But the point is that what we fail to realize that there is a popular legitimacy of the government taking over temples and running it. The Hindu majority supports it. This is often something we forget, right? So the work needs to be done at the grassroots level. You have to tell the people why this is not good, right? Simply by saying that the government should leave the control of the temples is not going to work.
That's true. That's true, sir. But the thing is, I want the government to show clarity how they are spending, because they are keeping opaque. Once when I asked one expert about this, they said once you open up one department for transparency, people will ask every department to show, all the other department, defense, this, that, everything, you show transparency. So they're keeping it opaque. Why can't they tell where they are putting our money, temple money? If they are genuine, if they are doing correctly, we don't mind. Because even if we give to private people, initially they may be good, but they turn after later, they'll also become corrupt. Is it not? It is human tendency, I mean to say.
Yeah, that's true. But I don't see a question there because I agree to that point. Yeah, there should be more transparency. Perhaps there should be more firewalls that you cannot use temple funds for any other purpose. That I think can be done.
But in South, they're using for roads. They're using for sending MLAs.
That's the failure of the Hindus in those states, right? That why don't you rise up against it? For that, you have to educate the people.
Madam, that's basically, no, the point is that's basically a temporary phenomena. It's our own reforms. We bring in some action in terms of political or legal or something like that. Ultimately, the larger issue of whether we want it with government or not is what he's talking about. If suppose there is transparency, obviously we are all happy. The point is, if you see the South Indian temples in Telangana and Andhra, compare them with North Indian temples which are not in the government control, they are pathetically maintained. There is no cleanliness, there is no discipline, and pandas come and fleece you. Whereas here we have some discipline. So government brings certain degree of cohesion, but this concocted political narrative of secularism and others have corrupted it. So we need reforming it. We need reforming it. Yeah, I think we'll leave it at that, right? Yeah. Thank you, madam. Thank you. Yeah. VSV Subramanian Garu, please go ahead, ask.
Namaskaram, sir. Namaskaram to the speaker and Mr. Abhinav and Mr. Giri. I always wonder why this country with so much of culture, knowledge, education and a huge population is not able to produce a dozen of statesmen who are capable of leading this country as prime ministers. Could you please throw some light on this?
No, that has always been a problem, not even in the modern time, but also in the medieval time. Unlike, if you compare to China, China has a long tradition of these statesmen coming not necessarily from the political class, but from their bureaucracy. I think the reason is that in India, the continuity was broken in a very decisive manner in the medieval age. So what happened that for centuries, India was the part of the Persianate, let's say the Persianate culture. So India's strategic, cultural, political traditions got disrupted in the 12th century, and India became effectively the culture which you adopted, the narrative you adopted in the 12th century was a Persianate culture, that is Sahanshah and those kind of ruling things. So I think that has led to and then came the British rule and the British systems. So I think that has led to lots of confusion in the, let's say, the way the people think about themselves and about the state. So this lack of coherency about what we are and what we want to do is the main reason why we don't produce great statesmen. Other problem is that the Hindus suffer from, as I told you, blindness about the word. So we don't know what is happening in the word. So if you don't know what is happening in the word, what are you going to respond to? Second point is that we also suffer from two very specific syndromes. One is what I call is Prithvi Raj syndrome, that you just don't know what to do with the power you have. You will never seize initiative. You will never cross the border and attack your enemy. So you don't know what you want to do. You don't know what you want to do with the power you have. And this is a problem in India. I mean, the Indian state is one of the most powerful states in the world. Your economy is decent. Your army is one of the most powerful armies in the world. But if you don't know what to do with it and to defeat your enemies, then whose problem is that? That's a Prithvi Raj syndrome. Second syndrome is what I say is Arjuna syndrome. Arjuna syndrome is what? That मैं अपने हाथ साफ रखूंगा. I will keep my hand clean. I will not do anything bad, even if the world burns down around me. And this is something you see every Hindu politician, the moment he gets power, gets trapped into this nonsensical worldview. That I want to become a great statesman. The moment they come to Delhi, they think that I'll become a world recognized statesman. I'll become known as a great transformative leader, win a Nobel Prize or whatever. This is a big, big problem. But I think that's essentially the Hindu problem. That's not necessarily the political problem. So the moment you get rid of this desire to become superpower, or desire to become statesman, or desire to become, the broadening of the word in the sense, you will start producing great people.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's actually a Hindu problem or a Delhi problem, we can figure it out. But I feel it's more a Delhi problem. I think we get out of Delhi, we'll be okay. That's a debate for another day. Appaji, please go ahead, sir.
So can you just, Abhinavji, can you able to, Namaskar.
Yeah.
It's all totally a different paradigm for me. I was really, it's thought-provoking. I need to think a lot on this, what you are all telling today. And one question was already was asked by Subroningar, I think, regarding the leaders, why we are not able to produce statesmen, leaders like that. The other thing is, you were telling at one point of time that whenever the Indian intelligentsia, they always talk about their culture or their past, but they are not really good at proposing ideas for this modern society. Something like that you were telling at one point of time. You have any models or any proposals on how to take that idea forward, or what do you all mean by saying that we need to be modern in our approach? We need to be able to propose new models for this developing societies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, you see, that is largely true. I mean, after Chanakya, who is your great political thinker? Can you name any great Hindu political thinker after Chanakya? None, right? So that's a problem. What to do about it? See, this is a work of generations. This is not that today I or you can completely change it. This is intergenerational change. I think we should start, first of all, by at least educating our people. India is, I mean, you talked about, everyone in India talks about Vishwa Guru hai Bharat. Arre, kahe ka Vishwa Guru hai? Most of your people can't even read and write. Most of your people do not have access to education. You don't have teachers in the schools, you don't have teachers in the universities. So we should start from the basics. Remember, a chain is as strong as its weakest link. So in India's intellectual traditions, India's intelligentsia will be as strong as the average person on the road. So you have to raise the intellectual educational level of the common masses the intelligent people, the intelligentsia will always rise up after that, right? So this is how I see it. This is my proposal, because I cannot give you a framework what to do about it to start producing great intellectuals today. But I think we need to really invest in the human capital. No one invests it. 70 years have passed. We just don't take education seriously in this country. In the past 6 years under this government, look at the HRD ministers. I think it's kind of a joke.
Yeah, no,
joke.
No doubt about it. We have no
so
hesitation.
First you make, if your person, the last person who is the poor person, uska jo level hoga intellectual, wahi aapka national intellectual level hoga. This is my idea.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Subramaniam ji, please go ahead. Where is Subramaniam ji? Yeah, Subramaniam ji, please go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, Girdhar. Hi, sir.
Yeah.
I think the toxic has already been done by our education system, and yeah, as like you said, the HRD minister is hardly doing any help. So, what from Indic learning or from Sanatic first should we leave away from this education system and go to our ancient like Gurukuls? Like we have still Sringeri runs few schools. Does it available for other castes? This is my primary question.
The question is not very clear. I think you are asking that can we go back to some ancient model? But yeah.
Correct.
But what model?
So ancient Gurukul system, right? We have that Gurukul system.
How can you have a Gurukul system? See, can you switch off your microphone, please?
Yeah.
How can you have a Gurukul system of the ancient kind? The modern economic structure, the modern production process needs mass education, right? So remember, the education system responds to the need of the time. The rise of industries requires that mass literacy and mass education, not necessarily creating intellectuals out of everyone. So Gurukul system of that kind you're talking about, and understandably you propose that how you're reorienting the Gurukul system to suit the needs of the modern economy. I don't see how you can go back to that. Are you getting my point, what I'm saying?
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that the modern education, modern economy requires mass education, which cannot be granted in the Gurukul system. So unless until you propose me the new structure of the Gurukul, I will be unable to comment on that.
Well, elements of the Gurukul could be, incorporated. For instance, Gurukul essentially meant that your education was away from your house. You have to go out of your parents' comfort, your comfort zone. Today, that's not what's happening. Children are getting pampered so much. There are some elements. And then there is also targeted teaching, right? You don't give all the 6 subjects to everybody, and then, somebody does exceedingly well in one subject, they lose in the other, still you call him a fail. Whereas in Gurukul system, Guru is to give, specific knowledge to the person depending on his capability. So that is coming back in some modern form where we are talking about a bunch of subjects. You could choose among them. Some concepts are coming up where probably some aspects of it could be reincorporated. But bottom line, sorry, I mean, I need to fully agree with you. 6 years of HRD minister. I think we leave
no, in the Gurukul system you're talking about, say this creative schools and creative mode of teaching which is coming up, that also reflects the changing economic structure. Now, once you move away from, let's say in the Western countries, the moment you move away from the mass production towards innovation-driven economy or towards services and creative economy, the mode of education will also change. So in Europe, you see, they have moved towards different kind of teaching system. It's no longer the education system we have today. What I'm saying that in India, we need the mass education system. That you need to equip masses with certain minimum educational levels so that they can go and work in the industries and can participate in the economic process, right? So you cannot replace that with the Gurukul system because that caters to a different kind of structure.
Yeah. Probably we can have a mix of both. I mean, you have mass as
Perhaps,
well
yeah.
as,
We are a large country, multiple
yeah,
systems.
we could do all that. Yeah. Thank you. There is somebody by name Oliver. I want to ask, please go ahead.
Yes. Hello.
Yeah, yeah, please go
Can
ahead.
you hear me, sir? The video is not power. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Good evening. Just my question was earlier, the speaker was saying that, okay, there will be, when you have power, okay, what will you do? Because Hindus basically are very complacent and they're very conservative and this thing. But my observation is we have an example by name Mr. T.N. Sesham. Okay, he rose to the position of a chief election commissioner. He understood the total system completely, and with his background and knowledge, he has seen that the system can be molded and everybody can be put under a control, provided you have thorough knowledge of this understanding, and then you can implement. That is, so when you acquire knowledge, you have to understand it thoroughly, and then you can keep people under control. It's not just once you acquire power, you are going to withdraw it away. That's my observation here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about the individuals, I'm talking about the society. So one TN session understands it does not mean that as a society you can also understand it. So we always confuse between the individual and the society. How do individuals behave as individuals and how do they behave as a group identity are always different.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, we could have, I mean, for 70 years, we didn't have somebody going and hitting Balakot. One Narendra Modi came and hit it. But that's not sufficient, right? We should have been hitting Balakots almost every couple of years for making Pakistan see sense. Yeah.
I mean, see,
Modi, yeah, please.
Modi doing it is okay. I mean, but where is the strategic culture in this country?
I agree. Absolutely.
Where is a Hindu deep state in this country which can make sure that Modi or no Modi it continues? So
absolutely.
That's what I'm talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's what I'm saying. Individuals shouldn't matter, but the overall culture should be a certain trajectory. I agree with you perfectly. Yes. Venkatramana ji, you wanted to ask another question?
Actually, precisely, I wanted to ask about what would have happened to Mughals in India had the Britishers not come.
Well, that's a very counterfactual history. I think Mughal Empire would have been replaced by the Marathas. That is what would have happened sooner or later. They would have faded away.
Yeah. In fact, they had already replaced it. Actually, Marathas had just kept the Mughal in Delhi only confined to old Delhi and not beyond.
Yeah. So Muslim power was fading. It was declining at a very rapid pace.
Yeah.
And they would have faded away. It does not mean that they would cease to exist. They would have remained a factor, a variable, a part of the Indian subcontinent, but their power would have been of no consequences.
Yeah, sure. And there is somebody with iPhone. You have not mentioned your name, madam.
My name is Bharti.
Oh, okay. It's okay. So write the name
Namaste, sir.
for us. Yeah,
Namaste, sir. Yeah. Namaste, sir. No, I'm very new to this. Actually, I'm taking my children's help and first I didn't get the video and all sorts of things happen. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Please go ahead and ask, madam. Yeah.
Sir, there are actually 4 things. First one is regarding education. A couple of people were discussing prior to me also. When I was going, I used to study in a Christian convent. In spite of that, there was a moral science, there were Jataka tales. There was an awareness of the Hindu culture, some moral stories about this. The teachers were Hindus anyway, working in a convent also. So that moral science concept itself has been taken out, be it Christian moral stories or Hindu moral stories or whatever it is. So I assume that is necessary for every child. And regarding the educational system also in India, if you look at all foreign educations, they put more emphasis on their own cultural ethos, their own history, everything. And 1 or 2 chapters will be there about the entire world, about other countries and everything like that. Maybe in the higher classes, they might be picking up that subject of India or Africa or whatever and studying. But in our case, most of the subject revolves around either science or something, but historically they don't, as you are explaining here on screen, like what happened, why it happened, where we are going, something like that never happens in our educational system. So educational system and textbooks have to be changed a little accordingly. That is one suggestion from my side. The other one is, as Narendra Modi's government has done a lot, if you look at so many things which we thought were impossible in the past 70 years have happened. But in addition to that, uniform civil code has to be implemented immediately if we are looking at a orientation of Hindu state or retaining some sort of our ethos or something. That uniform civil code where everybody will come under the same law irrespective of whatever religion you belong to. And the third point is like we as a country, we were talking about Hindus, these Hindus, those Hindus. In the government forms, wherever, why are we still sticking with the caste system? Why are we sticking with Dravidians or this caste, that caste, Brahmins, this, that? What is the necessity of still retaining the caste system anywhere in our, from the top to bottom, in any application form, including the school? Why are we still retaining a caste system where there is a division between the Hindus? So that is accordingly, I mean, it's not necessary for in any way. It is only helping us to divide among ourselves. Let's say I am from South India, Hyderabad. Here, let's say there is one Muslim standing in the election and there's one Hindu standing in the election. Muslims all, there is one person is there, they go there and vote. But whereas in this case, this gentleman comes from which community? Where is he coming from? What is his background? In what way are we oriented towards that caste? Whether that caste is favorable in our caste favor or something like that happens. So why are we still sticking with the caste system in the government forms at least? You cannot erase that mindset in the people of our country immediately, but why are we still sticking in the government institutes, schools, wherever we go? It becomes a mandatory. Why are we not going back to that economically backward classes? A part of it has been done saying that economically backward classes will be given some sort of reservations. Why don't we stick with that singular rule, whereas sticking with this? And the other one is, if you are looking at curbing the population or all of them growing in this only, the 2-kid rule should apply to every person in India, including Muslims. And if there is a third kid, maybe that gentleman cannot be elected, or his child, they will not get any government benefits or something along those lines should be taken up, because we cannot be too harsh, because all of us are ultimately Indians. So basically, these are the issues that I had with. I had a couple of more, but I forgot I should have written out. Anyway, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I completely oppose the population control laws and all, because if we implement the population control law, what is going to happen? It is going to destroy the Hindu demography only. You cannot, I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that we can implement population control law or on the Muslim community or on more orthodox people. We just can't do that. It's going to, make the situation of the Hindu TFR even bad. Say in Kerala, the problem is not with the Muslim population growth rate. Muslim TFR in Kerala is normal, is natural. It's the Hindu TFR which is unnatural. The Muslim TFR is what, 2.2, 2.3, 2.1 is the replacement level. Hindu TFR is 1.5, I guess, or 1.4. So who is being unnatural here? The Muslims are not being unnatural. It's the Hindus who are being unnatural by not producing kids. Now, that lower TFR of the Hindus in Kerala is compensated by someone in Bihar some Hindu in Bihar having 3 or 4 kids. So at the macro level, you're maintaining the demographic balance. The moment you bring that 2-child policy, you're going to destroy the Hindu of Bihar, which is having 3 kids or 4 kids, and maintaining the Hindu demography in the country, and you are going to make the situation worse, right? So this population control law, in my opinion, is the most counterproductive law ever to be thought of. The Muslim demography, the Muslim population growth rate also declines. Remember, in all the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia, like in the UAE, their TFR is below the replacement level. Even in India, the TFR of Muslims have declined rapidly in the last 20 years. In Iran, the TFR is almost at the equivalent level of the European countries. TFR is basically how many children on an average a woman has. That's a better measure of the population in the population increase. So Iran is Muslim. They have a TFR which is almost equivalent to the European level, which is very low. Now, what you want to do in India, if you want to control the population, let's say among the Muslim society, which is having 6-7 kids, only thing which works is everywhere in the world, number one is the access to modern education to the women folk. If someone is serious about controlling the population in this country, they're going to open up modern English medium school in every locality where you have high population growth rate. Within a generation, it will collapse. I can guarantee you that. If you bring a population control, this is again the Hindu way, not doing the hard work and coming up with nice sounding laws and rhetoric and ye kar denge, ye ho jayega. If you implement population control law, trust me, Hindu demography will be destroyed.
Absolutely. I fully agree with you. I fully agree with you. I think we need to maintain at least 2.6 average per Hindu woman overall as a gross level if we need to sustain the civilization on a long run. I fully agree with you. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah. So but, if you want to control...
Yeah, but even the Muslim population, especially the modern middle class and upwardly mobile Muslims, they're not producing 5-6 children. They're also sticking to these 2 children. One wife,
one or two children. So you give them socio-economic mobility, give them access to modern education, their population will automatically decline. Look at the data, the TFR has declined faster than the Hindu TFR in the last 20 years.
Perfect. Yeah, Faninderji, please go ahead, ask.
Sir, namaste, sir. Hello.
Hello.
Sir, namaste.
Your video is also off. Maybe you want to switch it on. Yeah, you have muted it yourself. You're done. Yeah, please talk. Yeah.
Namaste, sir. Good evening.
Yeah.
Sir, our Bharat is producing so many intellectuals and leaders in after even British rule, in British rule also. See now, even now, so many companies or in democratic countries, they are representing Indian origin people or Indians are representing in so many countries, in democratic countries. But the lacking is from British rule, the patriotism is in education is diverted or lacking. That is the reason. But India is producing leaders in our Hindu community is providing leaders. I want to share with Mr. Abhinav.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I mean, we, especially things like RSS and others, really produce some people. You know, maybe Vajpayee, Advani, Narendra Modi. You know, there are certain people, but then when it comes to the intellectual class in terms of providing an Hindu narrative in the modern context, they're probably social champions. They know how to galvanize the country and keep them united, and you know, social structures are all good. But at the larger intellectual level, what you said is right. That's probably, that kind of a leadership is not happening. You know, that's an area where you know, we are lacking. I agree with you, Abhinavji. What you said is right. I think his point is more to the political leadership rather than the intellectual leadership.
Yeah, the question was not very audible, but I agree with your point, Giriji, that we do produce lots of great people. It's not that India has become devoid of producing great people. Yeah. The point is that that we don't really produce great intellectuals, right? So we produce great politicians. We still produce great social champions, as we're talking about. We produce people who understand society, they work with it and change it. But as far as that big intellectual movement, see, at least in the North India, for 300 years, there has been no major socio-economic reform movement, socio-religious reform movement, sorry. Bhakti movement was the last movement. To an extent, the Bengal Renaissance and all these reform movements and new intellectual movements which came up in the 19th century, to an extent, they were also there. But even then, they are more than 150 years old. So you need to have new movements, social movements, religious movements, intellectual movements to make sure that you keep producing great people. So unfortunately, we don't have it for a very long time.
Yeah.
So I think that today Hindus actually need a new religious movement, right?
Yeah.
Something akin to Bhakti movement of that magnitude, then you will see the change.
Yeah. But then how do you see the civilizational clash with a more assertive China?
Yeah, China is the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
So we obsess with Pakistan, we obsess with all these people, but if strictly speaking from a Hindu perspective, Islamic world cannot challenge the Hindu military power today. Even if all of them unite, they cannot defeat India. In the hard, crude world. We obsess after them, I don't know why. The only problem which we have is a demographic problem in India. We do not have the power differential between the Hindus and the Muslims today is very, very high. It cannot be challenged in the coming years. So the only civilization, only country which can actually harm you is China. West can also harm you. The West is still very powerful, but it's the Chinese who are your hostile neighbors. How it is going to play out is very difficult to say because Chinese are unpredictable and we as Indians, I mean, how many China experts you have in India? How many Indians even know Mandarin? Do we even understand the Chinese polity? Do we even understand what is happening in China for the past 20, 30 years? So we are Vishguru of nothing. We don't know anything and we think that we are Vishguru. That's another problem. We are so self-obsessed that we don't even want to learn and understand anything. So how it is going to play out, I don't know. I think maybe a war is in the future. Maybe 30, 40 years or maybe earlier. I think China is the one with which we are going to clash. The Pakistan is simply the proxy of China today. Now remember that historically, even in the 15th century, the Chinese supported the rise of Islamic Emirates in the Southeast Asia to counter India. So China supporting Pakistan today is not nothing new. The Sri Vijaya Kingdom and Mahajati, what was that? Mahapati or Mahaj, I'm sorry, I'm not getting the name exactly. So they were Indianized kingdoms. And when you have the rise of the Islamic Emirates and Sultanates in the Southeast Asia, China was the power which was backing them, even in the 500 years back. So because Chinese know, they play the real game and they play the hard game. So I think they're going to go fully after India in the coming years as they become more powerful. How do we deal with that? I think I'm not expert enough to answer.
Yeah, Mahajanapadas. I think.
No, not Mahajanapadas. There's something else. Anyways.
Mahajanapadas. Yeah. I think we'll close it there. Maybe you want to give your final comments. I think we'll wind it up and then I think we more or less covered large parts of the topic. We'll probably end up repeating a lot of what we already discussed in some other form. Maybe you would want to give a closing comments and then we will go from there. Yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, from what I see, the purpose of this talk was to throw some ideas. Those ideas might sound a bit incoherent because, as I told in the beginning, those are the ideas in work. The point to remember is that the Hindu nationalism also consists of various strands. In my view, the Hindu nationalism has three strands. One is the radical Hindutva strand, which believes in a modernization, which believes in industrialization, which believes in a caste or a casteless or a post-caste society, which is very modernistic in its outlook. Second is the conservative strand, which is, the radical Hindutva is basically Savarkarite strand. Then you have the conservative strand, which is the RSS strand, which agrees with what the Hindutva Savarkarite strand says, but it says, let's go slowly. So RSS is basically supports almost every reform, every vision of the radical Hindutva, but RSS I'm using as a representative word because that is the largest organization there, which is conservative in its approach. We say, well, we don't want disruptive and radical changes because we don't know what will happen. So they say, let's go step by step, let's go slowly towards the ultimate aim. And then you have a section which is orthodoxy, which believes that all those things is wrong and let's go back to our old ancient Jati Varna system. Our ancient India was great and that's the only model which we have. So these are social orthodox which refuse to understand and agree and realize that the world is changing very fast and their old ideas will not survive. So there's a clash between the Hindu right or Hindu nationalist camp itself. Which strand will win will decide the future. And I think as we become more and more industrialized and modernized, this Savarkarite strand is going to become more and more dominant. Thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abhinav ji. It was a thought-provoking kind of discussion that we had. And you threw in a lot of ideas for people to munch. I'm sure a lot of people may or may not agree with some of the concepts. I mean, that's the way we are. We are talkative Indians, and I think we should keep it as a samvad rather than ending up into a vivad.
Definitely.
And thank you so much for being so candid. And I appreciate your line of thinking. Though, I mean, like all of us, we also have certain vision in terms of where the trajectory goes. But like what you said, we all live on hope. Let's see, hopefully the best happens to this country. And maybe wish that best happens to this country. Okay, thank you so much on that account. And then I thank all the audience also has come today. And it's been a very enlightening discussion. Thank you all. Bharat Mata ki Jai. Bharat Mata ki Jai. Namaste.